Hi everyone, I'm Annie.
And I'm Naf. Great to have you with us.
You're listening to Equals, the podcast where we break down the big topic of inequality and talk about why it matters.
And today we're diving into something that might sound a bit textbook at first, monopoly.
Yes, but stick with us because this isn't just about board games or dry economics. Monopoly is something that affects all of us and every single day, whether we realize it or not.
Totally, Annie. And it's one of those issues that shapes all of our lives, and we think it's high time more people were talking about it.
To help us get to grips with it, we've got a fantastic guest. His name is Nick Shaxson.
Nick is the co-founder of the Balanced Economy project, and he's written some pretty amazing and honestly quite shocking books like Poisoned Wells, Treasure Islands, and The Finance Curse.
This is really going to be an eye-opening episode. We're so glad that you're here for it.
Let's listen in.
Nick, welcome to Equals. We're really glad to have you here. Let's start out with your own backstory. So you've written for the Financial Times, New York Times, The Economist, and you wrote this famous hard-hitting book called Treasure Islands. It's about tax havens, and you took them on in this book. Now you're all in on taking global monopoly power. Why?
My book, Treasure Islands, about tax havens was really, when I wrote it, it felt like it was the kind of dark heart of the global economy. And in a sense, it was. It's kind of where tax havens is where really capitalism got perhaps most corrupted. It's a really kind of secretive, dark, unpleasant, corrupt system. And with a bunch of others, we started putting together it was a sort of civil society movement that became known as the tax justice movement. And we were able to really start raising attention about these issues, and governments started taking notice. It was after the global financial crisis, and governments were looking for sources of revenue, and everyone was angry with the rich and the bankers. And so we had a lot of kind of wind in our sails, and we were able to actually get a lot of kind of changes happening at a global level. Governments did actually put in place, a number of our recommendations to kind of crack down on tax havens. So more transparency and corporate tax changes and getting individuals to pay more tax. We never fixed the problems, but there was a really significant impact that this tax justice movement was able to have. Now, about 2017, I started noticing another movement that was happening in the United States. It was, again, a small bunch of people who had put together a kind of coherent story about monopoly power, about how monopoly power is everywhere. It was all around people. It was kind of like, they were sort of describing it like fish in water. The fish kind of don't realize the water is there. But once you point out that you're swimming in water and the water is getting more and more toxic, it becomes really important to tackle it. And this movement started getting incredible traction. It started getting massive media attention. And there were all these healthcare monopolies and, of course, big tech and agricultural monopolies. And they were squeezing the life out of farm country. And everybody was kind of waking up. You could see the lights going on in people's heads as they realized that this monopoly power was kind of squeezing everybody, in the same way that we in the tax justice movement had kind of seen lights going on in people's heads as they'd realized that, tax havens were being used to loot countries in the global south, were also being used to loot countries in the global north as well. And I was wondering, why is there no movement like that, no anti-monopoly movement like they have in the United States over here? So, I'm in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Why is nobody else really agitating about monopoly power? Why do we not have the equivalent of the tax justice movement? So I contacted someone in the US movement. I said, is there anybody over here doing anything? And he replied saying, no, there's nothing really. And at the same time, a lawyer in London called Michelle contacted him at the same time and said, is anybody doing anything? And he replied saying no, but you can talk to this guy, Nick, who's also interested. And we got talking and very quickly realized that, there wasn't an anti-monopoly movement really of any substance outside the United States. And so we decided to kind of set one up. So we started creating this thing called the Balanced Economy Project, which was, at the time, it was just two of us. And we started kind of putting together a new organization to take on monopoly power.
That was an incredible journey, Nick. Truly inspiring. And, these are exactly the kinds of stories we want to share. The ones that light a fire and get our listeners thinking about taking action. Now, could we zoom out for a sec and let's get everyone on the same page with a quick definition? So what exactly is a monopoly? And what is the harm of monopoly power? And also, more importantly, why should ordinary people care about this issue?
What is a monopoly? The dictionaries define it in a very simple way. They say a monopoly is a market where there's just one seller and then they have power to kind of raise prices. So if you imagine someone out in the desert and they've got a stand selling cold drinks and there's nobody else around, anybody who's passing along there, they can charge enormous prices and people will pay it because they're thirsty and there's nothing else. So that's kind of the dictionary definition. But actually, monopoly power is a much more subtle and pervasive thing than that, because in most markets, there are lots of different players. But I actually want to tell a story about my cat. I had a ginger cat called Sona, and he was lovely and cuddly. He was a bit annoying because he used to urinate everywhere in the flat. But we absolutely loved him, and he was really good at kind of defusing family tension. So if you had like one of the kids was really annoyed about something and slammed their bedroom door and went in there, you could pick up Sona and just sort of chuck him in the room and close the door again. And then 10 minutes later, there's some sort of strange feline energy would have kind of calmed the situation and everything would be good again. And so cats are kind of worth a lot. And when things go wrong, you will pay a lot of money to fix them if there's a good pet, a good cat, a good dog. One day we noticed Sona was panting heavily and he was kind of dripping this strange liquid from his tongue. So I raced him to the vet and the vet sent me straight off to the hospital. And so I went, it was quite a long way. I took him there, and by the time we got there, the vet had phoned ahead and they took him in immediately. And they said, yeah, he's got a weak heart and he's probably not going to live very long. But they kind of took him in overnight and they took €1,000 off my credit card as prepayment. And at the reception, there was this guy in a wheelchair. He was literally shouting at because he was so outrageous at the price he was being charged. They gave me the forms and I sat down and I noticed that this hospital was owned by a company that I had already investigated. And it has been buying up veterinary companies and pet hospitals all over the world. And it had bought by then about 2,500 different sites. So this enormous veterinary company, and it was able to charge extraordinarily high prices. Now, once again, there's not just one large veterinary company, there's all sorts of different veterinary companies. But what happens is they will buy up, a large company will buy up, let's say there's a medium-sized town that's got 5 or 6 vets in it. They'll buy up all of those vets. They'll leave their identities the same so no one can really tell. But suddenly it's got a little local monopoly in this town. And then they can jack up their prices enormously. So if you take in your dog to be operated on, suddenly the price will be 3 times what it was. And there's nothing you can do about it, because if you go to another vet, it'll also be owned in that town. It'll also be owned by the same company. One of the other aspects of this power is you can think about it like an hourglass. Over the years, you've had a steady concentration of power. You used to have 20, 30, 40 years ago in international food trading systems, you'd have 30, 40 companies. Now you've got 3 or 4 really big ones. And if you think of the hourglass with the food producers, the farmers at the top and the food consumers at the bottom, when the neck of the hourglass is really wide, so you have lots of different companies, you have choice. And you can, if you don't like what one company is doing, you can go to another company. But as the neck of the hourglass gets narrower, you have fewer and fewer choices. And these intermediaries, these fewer and fewer companies, which keep merging and joining each other, you have these companies able to extract more and more from both the producers, from the farmers. So the farmers get less money because there's this power in the system, there's this neck of the hourglass, but also from consumers. So they can raise prices to consumers, they raise prices to restaurants, raise prices to supermarkets, and it all trickles down. And so if they're paying less to farmers and raising prices to consumers, they're amassing an enormous amount of money in the middle. And that money goes into profits, into shareholders, but it also turns into political power. So these people start lobbying for laws in all the different countries to help them amass even more. And I think this hourglass idea, you find it all through our markets. It's not just food. It's all across our economies. And people just don't really see it. And it's something that it's a really good way of kind of understanding how our economies are structured. You have a few middlemen kind of with the power to extract money from both producers and consumers and make these huge profits, and then use those profits to lobby for even more favors and even more favorable laws. So the harms from monopoly power, it happens at various different levels. So the most obvious harm is prices. You have monopolists who have some sort of power in the market. They are able to raise their prices. And particularly in the pandemic, you saw they used the kind of emergency to really jack up their prices to consumers. And there was a study by an organization called SOMO, which does research on multinational corporations recently. And they looked at the top 1% of companies in the world, and they added up their annual, what they call markups, which is the difference between the cost of producing something and the price you sell it at. And they found that a total, this 1% of corporations worldwide, this top 1% of corporations, had combined markups of roughly 7 trillion US dollars on an annual basis. So that's kind of, that's more than 10 times the annual tax losses to tax havens. That's a really big number. That's thousands out of everybody's pockets each year. So these markups mean a pizza, for example, without the markups, without the excess markups from monopoly power, you might be paying $12. But with the markups in today's markets, you might be paying $15. So the difference between 12 and 15 is $3. And you can kind of consider that as like a private tax system that these people with power are able to extract from all of our pockets directly as consumers. But it's not just consumers, it's workers too. So again, they've had different studies. The share of global income that has gone to workers has fallen steadily. So as companies earn money, how much of it goes to workers, how much of it goes to owners in the form of profits? Well, the share is really tilting. And if we'd had the same level of competition as we had back in 1980, workers would be somewhere between $6 and $8 trillion better off. So workers would have more in their pockets. Consumers would have more in their pockets. But you also have this tremendous hit to small businesses because monopolists, they've all got kind of whole clusters of smaller businesses, suppliers all around them. And the monopolist behaves it's kind of like, you can think of it like a black hole with lots of stars circulating, sort of trapped in its gravity. So you have the monopolist, the black hole in the middle, and these smaller businesses are kind of unable to do anything. The terms are set for them, so they are operating kind of just on the margin of profitability, so they can just eke out a living. And all this, any surplus they generate, the monopolist will have all sorts of levers for kind of sucking that surplus away from them. And so there's a whole load of small businesses that are really kind of terrified and they cannot really do anything. So take a small supplier to a supermarket, the supermarket contract might be 50% of its business. And if the supermarket decides tomorrow to cancel its contract, that supplier might go out of business completely, might go bankrupt. So they're kind of terrified of the monopolist. So this is in the business world, but also there's a really close historical connection between monopoly power and fascism. It's kind of natural, I think, that these private centers of power are compatible with public authoritarian power. And when a monopolist is operating in a market, it has an enormous amount of power, and it's arbitrary power. It can set the terms within its own domain very much. And it's kind of like the rule of law is its rule of law. It's kind of like the privatization of the rule of law.
Wow, that's both extremely depressing and disturbing to hear, how widespread monopolies are. It feels like we're stuck, almost trapped in a system that leaves us at the mercy of these powerful monopolists, no? But at the same time, it made me think how it's absolutely crucial for all of us to wake up and to start investigating where our food actually comes from, who really controls our health.
So you've looked into the relationship between billionaire wealth and monopoly power. Can you tell us, what did you find? And what does this tell us about the relationship between inequality and corporate monopolies?
Last year, I did an investigation into this, and it was a report called Taken Not Earned. And it came out January last year at Davos time, and it came out the day after Oxfam put out its own report called Inequality Inc. on monopoly power. And one of the things that I did in that report was to investigate the richest 20 people in the world. And what became very clear is what I suspected, is that monopoly power is very much the secret source of nearly all of these people. What is it that makes them so stupefyingly rich? It's monopoly power. There are lots of other reasons. There's globalization and there's tax dodging. The real heart of the machine is monopoly power. So the richest financier, for example, in the world is a guy called Warren Buffett. He's American, and he is absolutely a monopolist. He had a quote: if you've got a good enough business, if you have a monopoly newspaper, if you have a network television station, your idiot nephew could run it. And what that sort of speaks to is just how easy it is. Once you've got a monopoly, you can kind of sit back and milk it. You don't have to innovate. You don't have to kind of stay on your toes. crushed everybody else. And basically, he's an investor who looked all around the economy and found companies that had monopoly power, had a lot of market power, and he invested in those. And he just got incredibly rich. Another famous example is the telecoms magnate Carlos Slim in Mexico. So for many years, he had a massive amount of power in Mexican telecoms, and he was able to charge extremely high prices, some of the highest prices in the world. And there was an OECD report that reckoned he was earning 20 billion a year just from this excess market power. And so the consumers in Mexico they have no choice but to pay this if they want to make telephone calls, because there weren't any good alternatives. And of course, he, used that to lobby the government for continuation of these favors. And it continued for a long time. I mean, it's kind of softened somewhat now, but still, he is one of the world's richest people. All of these top 20 people, basically, you can tell a monopoly story about them. They are so stupefyingly rich because they are able to lock down markets. And if they were not monopolists, they just would never be able to get that level of profits. So if we're thinking about billionaires, we really do need to start thinking about monopoly. And if we're looking to solve problems of inequality, monopoly power is a really fantastic place to start.
Thanks, Nick. That's really interesting. And, we did publish a report a little while back that found that 7 out of 10 of the world's biggest corporations have a billionaire as CEO or principal shareholder. So yeah, those two things, definitely have to be looked at together. Often when we hear about monopolies or we read about it in the news, a lot of them are in the US context. I'd like to ask you, what are the global monopolies that don't get enough attention? What are some of the industries that, keep you up at night?
I could single out all sorts of different sectors, but I think the ones that probably are most worrying and most important to think about are food and agriculture. You've got a whole series of monopolization games happening all over the place. You've got these giant commodity firms sewing up global commodity trade within countries, and across countries you have these giant supermarkets which are sewing up retail. You have these sort of financial firms that kind of speculate on commodities and they gain kind of financial power. The stranglehold that some of these companies are having increasingly on our food systems have incredible economic effects. And it is why, and if we were able to lift this stranglehold of these various different food monopolists, we would all have lots more money in our pockets, both as workers and as consumers. I would also single out finance. The financial sector is something I've written about for many years. And there is an enormous amount of power in the financial system. I mean, most famously, these too big to fail banks, which helped precipitate the global financial crisis. And they were so big that governments felt they had no choice but to bail them out. So these banks made huge profits, taking huge risks before the crisis. And then when the crisis happened, they kind of kept their winnings and governments bailed them out. And those big banks are even bigger than ever. I think those are the two sectors I'd probably single out, finance and food, as the next tier after big tech to really get worried about.
It's almost not surprising that the food, agriculture, and health sectors are the most monopolized, no? Meaning they are essential for our survival. And so we're almost forced to pay whatever they ask. Now, Nick, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the climate crisis. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. How do monopolies factor into that?
One of the things about monopoly power is that it tends to prevent kind of progressive changes in any field you care to think about. So if we're talking about labor laws or tax dodging or the climate crisis, you will find that there are big, powerful players blocking change, blocking reform. And those blockages are nearly always, or probably always, some sort of function of monopoly power. So in the climate crisis, you have very, very powerful energy companies who, again, there's a variety of them, but they also in their domains have an enormous amount of market power. And they are blocking change, partly because because they're monopolists, they are so profitable. They can throw money at the problem. They can throw money at governments, at politicians, at regulators, and prevent action. So if we want to tackle the climate crisis, we do need to tackle the power of these corporations that are blocking change. Now, governments, when they're governing well, they try and stop big companies collaborating. because that's like, they call it cartels. And when big companies collaborate, they collaborate often to raise prices together. So they don't compete, and let's all jack up prices, and then people won't have any alternative. But what they're sometimes saying now in with the climate crisis, like, we need to collaborate so that we can work together to make things better and make more climate friendly solutions. And it's an interesting problem there, because you have a tension between economic justice, so companies collaborating to maybe raise prices, and climate justice, which is fixing the climate crisis. And it's a very sort of delicate balance, and regulators are alert to this, and they're trying to get the balance right. But we need to make sure that it's very important that economic justice and climate justice go hand in hand. And so we need to find out imaginative ways to tackle the monopoly problem at the same time as tackling the climate problem. And that is primarily going to be through tackling the power of these giant corporations, particularly the energy corporations.
Agreed, Nick. The fight for climate justice must go hand in hand with the fight for economic and social rights, with the fight for an equal world. So, my last question for you. Okay, we have laid out the problems clearly. What are some of the solutions out there? Are there any big global efforts underway to actually tackle these monopolies?
There's kind of two ways to think about how you tackle this power. I mean, one is the kind of the solutions that I think many of us and campaigners and journalists and governments and politicians are kind of familiar with. And these are what I would call the indirect solutions to monopoly powers, like better tax policies that tax big corporations better labor laws that protect workers better privacy rules that stop these giant big tech firms stealing our data and manipulating our minds, better financial regulation. All of these things are absolutely essential, and these must continue and get more strong, get stronger. There's a lot of push for, better regulations, stronger regulations, these protections that people and citizens really need. Governments do need to protect their citizens. But one of the things that is being ignored is what I would call the direct measures. So this is where you are tackling the power itself. You are going after the power of these corporations directly. This is the area where civil society has, I think, not yet, outside the United States, really grasped the nettle. And when I say breaking up concentrations of power, the most powerful single measure, I would argue, is breaking up giant corporations. Now, the way to think about breakups is more not sort of smashing things up with a hammer, but like using a careful surgical Swiss Army knife. So it's got various different tools. And you take a giant corporation, you identify what is the source of the trouble, where is the problem in this corporation, and then slice along that line and separate it. Because quite often these corporations, and they manage to create these fantastic conflicts of interest. And so that's like where you have a playing field, and one of the players on one side is also the referee. And corporations all across the economy, giant monopolist corporations, enjoy these conflicts of interest and these kind of strange market power effects. And if we can break them up, if we can break these chokeholds, and if we can break open these, the neck of the hourglass, so where a few companies have a stranglehold, you release that stranglehold, you would get an enormous amount of wealth flowing back to producers and farmers, to workers, but also to consumers.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that, there's no getting around it. Tackling corporate power, monopoly power needs government to step in. I wanted to ask you, is there also something ordinary people and communities, people like you and me, can do to push back against this concentration of economic power?
Yes, there very much is. So in terms of personal, what can we do? What can I do? The number one thing is to organize. And that might be join a trade union or support a trade union. It might be join Oxfam and support, an Oxfam project. But it's working together with others to achieve particular aims. Organize is the number one recommendation here. That's what we can do. I think a lot of people are daunted from doing anything about this because it seems so complicated. you don't need to be an expert in corporations and how they work. You just need to understand that these corporations are too powerful. They're able to milk us. They're able to milk us as consumers. They're able to milk us as workers. They're able to sort of put in place these, what I call private tax systems to sort of literally take money out of our pockets through coercion. And they're able to influence governments and lobby them through their power, through their enormous power. These stories are actually very simple. So it's in a sense very easy to tell a simple story, a straightforward story that is a democratic story, and it's kind of internally coherent.
That was incredible, Nick. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking your time to speak to us. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Naf, what stood out for you?
Wow, Annie, that was insightful. But I also won't lie to you, the more I learn about this issue, monopoly, the more I feel suffocated. But the good thing is, I guess, it also stirs me into action. First thing I want to say is, how all of us need to realize that we are living in a monopolistic world. And, despite capitalism and its narrative of free competition, it's actually creating more power for the few. And the rest of us are being subjugated, and we need to realize that. We need to investigate everything in our lives, where the goods and services come from, who we are paying to, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like Nick said, sometimes it can feel really daunting or confusing, is there actually something that I can do? But he gave some good examples of things that, people can do, join a trade union, support one. And, there are also community-based initiatives or groups. And I'm sure many of our listeners are involved in, initiatives that we could learn from or that others can learn from.
As Annie said, if you're doing something in your community to fight against monopolies, please reach out to us. We would love to hear your stories.
Definitely. You can connect with us on social media at Equals Hope on X, and also subscribe to our newsletter at equals.inc, INK, for updates on inequality and how to tackle it.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.